Hi everyone. I would like to talk a little bit about some of the, foundations of this course in African philosophy. And if you see the beginning of our syllabus, which is right here, you'll see that the first module that I have after the introduction module is called Doing Philosophy as If the World Exists. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today. I think the way I think about African philosophy really is in a certain sense as a microcosm of doing philosophy itself, not as simply a kind of bounded area of ideas and concepts and questions, but really something that informs all of how we do philosophy. That's in fact how I've found it to be over the last however long I've been working in the area. And so I'd like to treat this course not just as a kind of what I think of as a regional course. In other words, a course about what people in a particular region might think about something. But rather as a course that allows us to reflect on doing philosophy itself. As I sometimes like to say, every act of philosophy is an act of metaphilosophy. And you might not have come across that term before, metaphilosophy, but what it means is thinking about how we actually do philosophy, right? If you think about other kinds of disciplines, literature or biology or, whatever, they have a set of methods. They have an object of an analysis that they are analyzing, building on, discovering things about, and then they go about doing that. And so they do sometimes reflect on their own processes of doing that, but that's probably not the majority of what they do. In philosophy, I'd like to think that every time we do philosophy in some sense, we're thinking about how we do philosophy. And so it's a kind of recursive or self-reflective sort of enterprise. It doesn't make it better or worse than other kinds of disciplines, but it does make it a kind of unique sort of activity that we have. And so what I want to do is think a little bit about how African philosophy gives us a way of thinking about how to do philosophy itself. And that's going to become really important throughout this course. And in particular, it's going to become important because I want to handle this course somewhat differently than it's often handled when it's taught in other places. Often people think about doing African philosophy as simply transplanting the classic categories of philosophy into Africa. So, when we think about philosophy, we think about doing metaphysics, or we think about epistemology and ethics and value theory of various sorts, aesthetics and, maybe economic theory, maybe other kinds of value theory. And so we might think, what we're looking for is a specific African approach to those kinds of questions or those categories which exist everywhere. And so that's one way that it's often taken. So, we'll often see in textbooks that try and be, take into account that there's more than just Western philosophy in the world. They might have a category that says, the nature of truth. And now we're going to look at how truth is understood in China and in India and in various places in Africa, and then various writings about truth in the West. So, there's another kind of approach, which is to think about it in the context of what we might call comparative philosophy, or sometimes intercultural philosophy, or multicultural philosophy, or even non-Western philosophy. And so, in these kinds of approaches, we often are assuming that there's some basis for comparison, right? So we're coming from, a particular context, a particular place. Let's suppose that's Western philosophy. And now we're going to compare, non-Western ideas or approaches on specific topics to how we might think of something in the West. And so it seems to me all these approaches don't interrogate Western thinking. They don't interrogate the way we think about questions in the West. It simply assumes that how we do things here is how we do things, and now we're going to go out looking elsewhere in the world and figure out, now that we've set the questions, now that we've set the categories, now we're going to go out and ask, well, how do these people do it? How do those people do it? And that seems to me to not go deep enough, not go far enough back, right? It leaves the assumptions of Western philosophy largely unquestioned, uninterrogated. And so I want us in this course to go further than that if we can, right? Really the question, I think the fundamental question is, and this is not just for African philosophy, but I think for any philosopher, that is, how do we ask philosophical questions? Where do these come from? How do we recognize the commitments of the questions that we have? I mean, often in philosophy, we try and think that, our questions have to be the most general, the most universal kinds of questions. So we tend to think that, a philosophical question looks like this: what is truth? What is being? What is the good life? We could probably make a list of these sorts of questions, and those don't necessarily look like questions that have any kind of origin to them or any point in history that they emerged from. It looks like they're kind of the most general possible questions we could ask. And so we come to think that that's in fact true about them, and that, we're not asking, what do women think about this, or what do men think, or what do Africans think, or what do Europeans think, or people from China, or people from here or there, or wherever, right? It seems like we're not asking those questions. What we're asking simply is, what is truth? What is beauty? What is the good life? Etc. All right? What I want to argue is that putting questions in those terms disguises their commitments to what I'm going to call place. Okay? In other words, our questions come from places. They can't help but come from places. They can't help but come from a set of assumptions, a set of historical concerns, social structures, a set of audiences, a set of things that make those questions make sense in some way to us. And so when you hear the question, what is being, or what is truth, or what is whatever, those things get translated in our own minds into the more specific terms that define our place. Okay? And so it's a little bit disingenuous, I think, to ask, well, let's just go out and look at what different cultures say about this, and we'll just kind of make a compendium of, well, here's what people in the West say, and here's what people in Africa say, and so forth, as if it's all the same question, because it's often not actually the same question at all, right? Now, this is a certain kind of, statement on how to do philosophy in general. It's not just how to do African philosophy, right? I mean, even if we suppose that our goal is to get to, in some Socratic sense, to get to this kind of most general sort of sensibility of how to ask a question, it's arguable that we've never actually been able to achieve that, and that goes back to however far back you want to go in human history, And so if we all are in some sense rooted in our place, which includes race, includes gender, includes language, includes all sorts of other things, but we're not bound by those things, right? In other words, we are intelligible across those lines to each other with some work sometimes, but it is possible to be intelligible. But if those things still exist, right, then we are asking questions out of those even when it seems that we're not, even when it seems that we're somehow rising above all of those sorts of things. One of my major projects is what I call philosophy in place. That is the idea that while philosophers are interested in universals, universals are something that is earned. It is not presumed. All right? So in other words, we can't start from the notion that, well, now that we've got a question like what is beauty, or what is, in that kind of very simplified form, now we've achieved a universal question. We haven't yet, right? We haven't at all. What we do is strive for universals, and that striving takes the form of dialogue between people that have tangible differences. It takes the form of creating concepts that are adequate to a place. We're going to talk more about that this term. It has the nature of a task. In other words, philosophy is not a set of beliefs that one holds, but it's a task, a way of engaging the world. All right, and so, I think of philosophy less along what I think of as a kind of neoliberal model of ownership, right? So sometimes we think about philosophy as being a set of propositions that we own, that we mentally own. So I believe this, I believe that, I believe this, and then we argue for those things. We try and convince others of those things, and and so our goal is to, in a certain sense, have full and complete ownership over a set of concepts or over a set of propositions. And we do that by producing the best possible arguments for them. And so I want to challenge that view of what philosophy is actually about. What I want to do is move philosophy from the notion of the proposition to being about questions, right? Asking a good question. So we still have propositions, but propositions are always a moment on the way to the next good question. Right? They're provisional. They're part of a movement. Okay, and so philosophy, in a certain sense, is an endless kind of engagement. It's not simply a set of beliefs or isms or something like that. It is a way of interrogating the world that takes into account the salience, the significance of the place in which you find yourself. So, for example, even in concepts that look like they're fairly universal, like, gender or race or something like that, when you start drilling down into those and you start looking at how they actually manifest themselves, in different places, what you come to realize is that they're actually quite different, right? I mean, there are similarities, of course, across, national and international boundaries, but often there are things that are not the same. I mean, I like to use the example of race, which is, the very same person in the U.S. could be black, in Brazil could be white, and in South Africa could be colored. Okay, the very same person. How is this possible? Well, it's possible not because that person changed, but because the concept changed and the notion of race changes between those three places. And we could, continue that and look at other places and see how that works elsewhere as well. And so what does that mean? Does that mean that race is just, whatever you want it to be, or it's nothing at all? Well, it doesn't mean that at all, right? What it means is that we come to understand a concept like that in a constellation of other concepts, in a constellation of other kinds of social structures and intellectual structures and conversations that go back, through time and all sorts of stuff like that. And so understanding a place means understanding that space in which a concept becomes salient or becomes viable. And if we use what looks like the same concept, might only be the same word, but what looks like the same concept in another place, what we have to do is some translation, right? We have to say, well, okay, race means something in the U.S., or it means a set of things in the U.S. It means a slightly different set of things in South Africa, and maybe a different set again in Kenya, different set again in Nigeria. And that's part of the richness of that concept. Understanding how to move across those borders is precisely the act of asking a question, asking a philosophical question about what race means in these places. So it doesn't reside up here in the kind of abstract sphere, available to everywhere. It is always being worked out, right? And it's being worked out through our conversations, through our lives, and so forth. So for me, what that means is that philosophy is is much a lived thing as it is a kind of intellectual thing, okay? And what I am doing here is not only leading you into a rethinking of what philosophy means, but leading you into a thinking of what African philosophy might mean. Because when we use the term philosophy in the context of Africa, we can mean more than one thing, right? We can mean the intellectual products of people going back to the beginning of time, right? Maybe not just written texts, but maybe oral texts, maybe religious structures, maybe a whole variety of different things. Or we can mean what we do in universities, which is what we might call academic philosophy. And if we take those two things, philosophy as the expression of how people act and how people have thought about their world, and the academic study of philosophy, we could see in Africa that those are vastly different kinds of things, right? I mean, academic philosophy probably only goes back, into the 20th century, whereas what we might want to say as philosophy in Africa as a lived phenomenon goes back as long as there have been people. It goes back into ancient Egypt. It goes back into the traditional ways of the Yoruba, and of any number of other people, Nuba and Dogon and all sorts of other people. We can profitably study these systems to think about how these people were making sense out of their worlds. Okay. And we can get into some finer distinctions where we kind of distinguish between philosophy and anthropology and other kinds of things. But for now, let's take that as a significant distinction. Okay, and so what I'm advancing here is the idea that philosophy itself might be thought along a more African model, which is a way of thinking through, with a view to one's own history and tradition, with a view to how we leverage that into something that is viable and has currency or significance in the contemporary world. How we relate to the historical texts, even if those texts are oral texts, even if those texts are passed down in the form of tales and proverbs and songs and whatever. How is it that one can relate to that past in a philosophical manner, not just in a kind of cultural manner? How can those be the stuff of thinking through at a philosophical level what one's world is about? So what I'm saying here in a certain sense is that when we think about African philosophy, we're thinking about not what I'm going to call a regional philosophy, right? I mean, sometimes we might think that, these philosophies that come with a place or a name attached, Asian philosophy, whatever that means. I mean, the place is huge, like hard to know how we wrestle that into one thing. But, Aboriginal philosophy, First Nations philosophy, and then African philosophy. I mean, it looks like, in a certain sense, what we're saying is that there's a philosophy that is of interest to or of relevance to a certain group of people, but no one else. All right? So we might imagine, incorrectly, that African philosophy is something that only Africans should really be interested in because it's about their experience, their world. So, as I say, I think that's not a useful way to think about it, and not a correct way either. I think of African philosophy in many ways the same way that I think about feminist philosophy. All right. So here's the thing about feminist philosophy. Feminist philosophy is not just philosophy that is only of interest to women or only of relevance to women. It is philosophy that comes from the experience of women. In other words, it's essentially from a place, from a body of experience, and it makes available a set of concepts to think about the world in ways that had not been available from other perspectives, right? And so, if we look at advances in epistemology with things like standpoint epistemology, with discussions around testimony, in ethics, care ethics and other approaches to ethics. I mean, you go down the line in philosophy and what you get is, perspectives given by feminist philosophers who are saying, if we take women's experience seriously, if we take gendered experience seriously, if we take LGBT experience seriously, that makes available to us a set of concepts that we wouldn't have available otherwise. Now, if we think of it that way, that means that those concepts are available to all of us, not just to those who are parts of those groups, right? And indeed, I think the world is a richer place. The philosophical world is a richer place for the work that feminist philosophers have done, right? There are ways in which you cannot teach ethics properly at this point without taking into account feminist approaches to ethics, right? There has been a major addition to how we think about how to be ethical in the world. Similarly with other areas of philosophy, right? So I want to get away from that notion that having a place, being in a place, is somehow a kind of straitjacket, somehow something that limits us, and limits the philosophical reflection in that area to only people who are in that area, right? And so similarly, I think for African philosophy, it is not a regional philosophy. It is philosophy from the perspective of Africans, right? Now, we're going to, in modules coming up, try and define what does that mean? Who is African? What does that mean? What does the place mean? I mean, there's lots of ambiguity, lots to discuss on all of that. But if we start from that premise, that idea that what we're looking at here is the development of a set of concepts that would not be available otherwise, I think we've got something really important. Just at the basic level, right? Even if we look at the indignities that Africans have undergone throughout the last several hundred years of human history, colonialism, settler extraction of resources, slavery, apartheid, if you have to think through your world with that as a reality, right? That's something that much of the West has not had to think through when they've developed philosophy, right? So already you have different ideas available about what community looks like, what property looks like, what thriving looks like. I mean, just all sorts of different things. And so that's why I think African philosophy has something hugely important to offer. And so that's the approach I want to take to it this term, not just as, here's something that, it might be of relevance to a bunch of Africans, and we're going to look at it as if, we're not from there, but, it's kind of interesting. Let's take a look at it. Well, okay, we're not from there. I've been there lots of times, but that doesn't make me African, obviously. But nevertheless, I think there's something important for us to think about, as long as we're willing to take seriously the questions that African philosophers themselves are asking, the ways that they are responding to their world, the experience that they have, the texts that they've written. As long as we take that stuff seriously, I think we have a great deal to learn. So, in this course, I have, given you lots of stuff to read, and I've done something in this course that I almost never do. I basically never do, which is I've given you a bunch of stuff that I've written to read. And so this module, I've given you 2 papers that I've written, and really both of them are directed at this fundamental question, that is, how do we think Africa philosophically that is not simply a reductionist sort of approach. And so the first one is an older paper called Philosophy as if Place Mattered, the Situation of African Philosophy. And if you take a look through it, what you'll see is that it's a paper that really tries to kind of do what I just have described, which is move away from that kind of universalizing idea of philosophy, which seems like, those in the West have already established what it means, and now the job is to figure out how Africa fits into that. In that paper, I've really kind of tried to just take apart that approach and used as the example questions around tradition and how one approaches tradition, when you're looking at it from an African point of view. And this is, in some sense, stuff from my first book, which was called Philosophy in an African Place. And so that's one of the readings that we're going to have. The second reading is this one. Let me go back to the top here, Edges of African Philosophy. And this too, in some sense, tries to think through how how we can do philosophy in a manner that's not reductionist. In other words, in a manner that doesn't simply reduce Africans to be straitjacketed into a set of localized concerns, but at the same time takes seriously the idea that they, and indeed all of us, are from places. And so I summarize that with this little summary here, which is, and these are things that I've already mentioned, at least the first 2 things. Number 1, ask real questions. Number 2, make new concepts. And number 3, don't be stupid. And so I kind of develop all 3 of those in this paper. You might be interested in what I have to say about being stupid. but I think the two of these serve as a kind of launching pad for really how to rethink how we do philosophy itself, not just how we do African philosophy. Now, of course, our concern in this class will be African philosophy, and so as we look at the syllabus here, you can see that the way I'm approaching this is with some fairly general questions. What is African philosophy? Which, by the way, is a question that can be a very problematic and dangerous question, and I'm going to describe why that is when we get there. Where is Africa? Who is African? And then we're getting into method and the kind of major threat, if you wish, over the last few hundred years, which has been the history of especially white incursion, but not only white incursion into Africa, and the forms of colonialism, slavery, settler extraction, and apartheid. And we go on to look at a number of other kinds of areas, finishing off with questions about African philosophy and the future. I want to think about African philosophers who have looked to the future to think about what it might look like. So some Afrofuturism, the notions around Ubuntu, and some issues are connected to negritude, and so that's where we're going with this course, and I hope you get an idea of how to do philosophy, I guess, differently than maybe the Western canon or the Western approach has taught most of us to do philosophy. I think that there's a real richness and a real possibility to see with new eyes and hear with new ears if we're able to ask, how do we get at the questions that are being asked, not simply the propositions being held or the ideas being held by people, although those two are important. What's really important is how people are engaging the world, how people are able to use their forms of thought in order to live within the world that they find themselves. So that is just a quick overview of where we're going with this. So take a look at those two papers, and I'll be interested in your comments and thoughts. I guess I'm less concerned about whether you like what I say or don't like what I say. I am interested in whether you agree or not, but I'm always looking not just for agreement but for reasons for things. So if you disagree, that's great, but I'm looking for reasons. If you agree, that's great. If you see how this matches up with something else that you've seen from other philosophy classes, that's great too. So as much as possible, I want to try and integrate this into the larger philosophical discussion, so that when you're done with this class, what you've learned is not just a few facts about African philosophy, but a way of doing philosophy that is inspired by Africans. So that is my pitch for this week of doing philosophy as if the world exists, and look forward to the discussion.